All right. Hello and welcome back to SAS Bootcamp week 6, video 5. In this video, we are switching gears and we are going to learn about macro variables. Another one of those really simple things that is very nifty and very, very important when when doing health outcomes research, at least in my experience. So macro variables, to give you a brief introduction, macro variables are a way to define shortcuts within SAS. So a macro variable is like a keyboard shortcut. What you're telling SAS when you define a macro is that every time you want to refer to this long string of characters, instead of refining the long string of characters, you're going to instead refer to it using this shorter string, which is a macro. And every time you use that shorter string, which is that macro, SAS reads it as the longer string. So it basically saves you time and effort while doing programming. It's easier to show this and demonstrate this through an example. So let me talk about how we are going to use macros in this particular example in this video. So for this particular video, we are going to be using a file called ndc_fad690str. I've had to use this file because this is actually very similar to the NDC file we looked at earlier in this bootcamp. Unfortunately, when looking at these when uploading these files to the SAS Studio, I've discovered that there are size limitations on the file, which meant that I couldn't just use the variables that were in the other data set. I had to create a new data set. All of that to say, this is the file we are looking at. It is similar to the previous file we used in this bootcamp. We have an NDC code, a full category name, and this numerical strength of each drug that we are looking at in this data set. So let's say, for example, we will write a simple piece of code that does the same thing using principles we've seen earlier, and then we're going to convert this code using macros to show you the power of macros. So I'm going to use my simple data step in my set statement. I'm going to set the data set we just looked at, ndc_fad690str, and we're going to create a new file called ndc file calcium, which contains calcium channel blockers. I'm going to create these calcium channel blockers. I'm going to subset my calcium channel blockers from this file using the where statement. The where statement basically says where lowercase of full category name contains the word calcium. So if the word calcium in lower cases is present inside full category name, those are the rows that are going to be in my final data set. And I've also added one other subsetting statement, an if statement. In the if statement, the condition I've listed is if strength underscore num underscore amount equals 250. Which means when the strength variable is equal to 250, only those rows actually will be added to my final data set. Every other row gets automatically deleted from my file. This syntax and this form of data steps we've seen before, so this should not be new for you guys at all. Hopefully by now you're comfortable writing data steps like that. You can check your log, make sure it looks okay. When you open your output data set, you see there are actually just 2 rows. There are only 2 calcium channel blockers with a strength of 250 in our final data set. So now that this has run, let's see how to do this using macro variables. The way to define a macro variable is using the %let command. The %let command tells SAS that you're going to define a macro and what is the name of the macro and what is the value that should be stored inside that macro. Here, I'm defining a macro variable called str. While this is called a macro variable, remember that this is not a variable in a data set. Like we usually refer to variables, this is a macro variable. This is stored in your computer's memory. This is stored within SAS. It's not a column of data within your data set. It's a macro variable. And within str, the macro variable, we want to store the value 250, right? And then we finish with the semicolon. So the definition of a macro syntax is really simple. You don't need a data step or a set statement. You don't need a proc. You just need one line of code, similar to that libname statement we've been running, which says %let, name of the macro variable, value of that macro variable. That's it. Once you've defined the macro, you have to run this little line of code, and SAS log will produce this little output, which is actually a very vague statement. It doesn't tell you something was run. It doesn't tell you if it was successful or if there is a warning or an error. It just shows the code that you ran within the log with some other options around it, right? There is no output out of this code. It just gives you that one line of code in the log. That's how you know that it has been run. one thing to remember when you're running macros is that the macros that we are defining using %let are actually local macros. What we mean when we say local macro is that if I were to close my SAS session and if I were to reopen it, SAS would not remember that there is a macro variable called str which has the value 250. So if I define my macro variables with the %let statement, SAS will remember that macro variable str and save the value 250 within that variable only as long as this SAS session lasts. If I close my SAS session, SAS will forget that macro variable and I will have to rerun this line of code in order for SAS to remember that that is a macro variable. Okay, so once we've defined it, the next thing is to actually invoke or refer or call that macro. How do you call a macro? You can call a macro using the % option. So let me show you guys how to do that. So we are going to copy and paste this exact code, right, exactly as it is, but instead of writing 250, we are going to write &str instead. So str is the name of the macro we defined in SAS earlier. And when we want to call on that macro, we will refer to it using the & symbol in front of the macro name. And when SAS reads &str, it is basically going to replace that macro variable with the numbers it was fed earlier, which is 250. So instead of &str, SAS will read this as 250 in order to execute it. But that's not the only place where you can use macros. You can even add those macro variable names into the dataset names. So here in my dataset name, I've actually added this in. So I've said ndc_file_ca &str, and SAS will replace &str with the words 250. So let me go ahead and run it. And we can see how this works. You can see from the output that it got the same exact answer, right? We've got 2 rows, which was what we got when we ran this without the macros. And when you look at the log statement, the log doesn't tell you that much. Now the log tells you, for example, that 2 observations were written, but it doesn't tell you that &str actually means 250. You have to infer that from the previous code that we wrote where we said %let str equals 250, right? And the output data set, you'll see that the output data set's name actually has 250 in it. This is ndc_file_ca 250. And the code worked perfectly. So the macro variable here can be utilized at any place within the data step. You can use it within the data set's name. You can use it within the code, within an if statement as a condition, or you can use it anywhere else, right? And every time SAS sees &str, it's going to simply replace that with 250 and execute the command as if that macro was never written. If you want to reuse this macro, this time not for a numeric value, but for a character or a string value, right? Because previously we used 250, which is numeric. It doesn't have to be numeric. You can save macro values which are strings or characters. So let's show an example of that. Here we are defining a macro variable called class, and we are setting class to be equal to ACE or ACE. The reason I'm doing ACE is because our NDC file we saw earlier has ACE inhibitors, which is a class of medications. We want to use ACE inhibitors as the value of the macro in order to get ACE inhibitors to be pulled out of that data set. Okay, so here I'm defining my macro statement using the %let option. The log gives you that vague statement again without any indication of whether the code was successful or not. It just gives you that little line of code. And then in my data step, here I'm writing my dataset name as ndc_file_class. And in my where statement, I've got the same exact thing that we did earlier, except instead of calcium, in this case, I'm interested in ACE inhibitors. So I'm saying contains, and within quotes, &class, right? And when SAS sees &class within those quotes, it's going to interpret that as ACE instead of &class, and it's going to execute that code to look for rows of data that have ACE inhibitors in there. So you'll see here, the log ran just fine. And it says here in the note that where lowercase full category name contains ACE. So it's even though when we wrote the code, we wrote contains &class, the log actually displays that &class means ACE, right? And if you check your output, you'll see that every single row of data in the full category _name variable has the words ACE in there, has the character or the string ACE in there. So we know that the code worked. So basically what this did is it replaced the ampersand class with ACE, and it only pulled out those rows of data which had the ACE string in there. The really interesting thing to note here, and this is the part where you have to be careful, macros can be a little bit tricky. When you are using a string in that macro variable as opposed to numbers, you have to be careful about whether the strings actually include quotes or whether they don't include quotes, as I showed you now. The example I showed you now worked just fine, but if you are using a different version of SAS, particularly sometimes if you're using a version of SAS which is installed on your computer but might not have all the add-ons installed, this might not work. Right? So you have to be a little careful about whether you use quotations or not within your string variables for your macros. I want to show an example of how this works and why this is different in the next example here, and then we can talk about which one we want to use. So let's say, for example, that we want to do the same exact thing we did earlier, but this time, instead of calcium channel blockers or ACE inhibitors, we want to output vasodilators. In order to do this, I'm going to define 3 different macros. I'm going to define a macro called class, which I'm going to set to vasodilator, but this time with quotes within my macro variable. So remember, when you add quotes in the macro variable's definition, SAS is going to remember the macro class to have the value vasodilator and quotes before and after. And I'm also defining a second macro variable called class name, which has the same value vasodilator, but this time without any quotes. Right? And I have a third macro variable str, which I'm setting it to 400, and this is numeric, so the question of quotes is not a problem. I'm just going to set this as a numeric value without any quotes. Let me run all 3% let statements first. Okay. Macro variables have been defined. Now, in my data step, you'll see I can get a little tricky. In my data step, I've used ampersand class name, which is my macro variable without the quotes. And in my where condition, I'm using ampersand class, which is my macro variable with the quotes, right? And I also have my and strength num amount equals ampersand str, where ampersand str will get replaced with 400. And because that is numeric, that should not cause us any problems. The use of quotes within these macro variables has been obviated in the later versions of SAS if you have all the plugins installed, which SAS Studio actually does support, which is why this previous piece of code ran. If you don't want to rely on that, and if you want to be careful about where quotes are added and where quotes are not added, be sure to use macros with quotes present or not present exactly as you want. If you use macros with the quotes present, you can use them as part of a condition like this, and it will work just fine, right? Because SAS will read this as lowercase full category name contains, within quotes, vasodilator, which is exactly what you would write here if you weren't using macros. Similarly, ampersand class name gets replaced with the word vasodilator without quotes. So this would also be exactly what the code would look like if you were not using macros in here. Okay, you look at the log here and you'll see that the word ampersand class got replaced with vasodilator with quotes, and the word ampersand str, the macro variable ampersand str, got replaced with 400, which is exactly how we defined it. And if you look at the output data set, the data set's name has the word vasodilator and the name 400 in it. So you know that these macro variables got passed appropriately. Let's tweak the code a little bit and see how this changes. So if I instead write the macro class name in here, you'll see that the SAS code will throw an error. See that? So now what is happening is that if I use class name, which is vasodilator without quotes, SAS is actually thinking that vasodilator is a variable name as opposed to a string that it should look for, right? And there is no variable called vasodilator in the data set, so that throws an error. So here you have to use the version of the macro that does not have quotes. Similarly, in the dataset name, if I use the macro which does have quotes, you know quotes cannot be separated in dataset names in SAS. So if you run this code, it says user does not have appropriate authorization level, which is a roundabout way of saying we couldn't run this because the dataset name you're requesting has quotes in it, and we can't have quotes in datasets names within SAS. So you have to use ampersand class name the macro which does not have quotes in order to make this work. Having said all that, the last thing, and perhaps the other very, very important thing that you need to observe when you are using macro variables is using periods or a full stop when referencing or calling the macro. See, the easiest way to call the macro is to just list the macro variable name, and then the ampersand symbol before that name, right? Like right here, ampersand class, right? This will work in every single case unless the character that comes right after the macro variable name is not a space or a semicolon or a closing quotation mark, right? If the character that comes right after this one is a different string, so for example, like this one, if it is an underscore, then you have to be careful. And in order for SAS to parse out that macro name correctly, you have to add a period right after the name of that macro. That period is only to convey to SAS that what comes before the period is a macro variable name and not just a string, right? So if I omit the period here, you will see that SAS will not recognize that class name is a macro. See, so it does not recognize that class name is a macro, and SAS is telling me you can't have an ampersand in a variable name, in a data set name. But instead, if I add the period in here, SAS will recognize that that is actually a macro, and the code will run just fine. So remember to add those periods every single time whenever the character that comes right after the macro variable name is not either a space or a semicolon or a quotation mark. If it's not one of those three things, you will need a period after the macro name, and having the ampersand alone is not going to be enough to call the macro. That concludes macro variables. We're going to come back in the next video and learn about macro statements and really talk about how you can take macros to the next step.